here. Next slide, please. This framework, which is included in the guide as Exhibit 1, traces the path from the planned intervention to its impacts. It's an adapted version of the conceptual framework developed by Mike Weiss, Howard Bloom, and Tom Brock in their 2014 article in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. We wanted to show this figure to sort of place where we are in space in terms of the guide and implementation research in this broader framework. And we'll start on the right-hand side of the figure with a familiar idea, we hope to most everyone who's here. An estimated impact is the difference between average outcomes for the intervention group and the control group. The control group outcome provides an estimate of the counterfactual or the intervention group's outcomes in the absence of the intervention. Click, please. As shown in this part of the framework, impacts are driven by differences in intervention model components that are received by the intervention group, and top in blue, and the relevant services that are received by the control group across the bottom. The difference here is the intervention contrast. Other terms for this contrast in the literature include service differential, program differentiation, and achieved relative intervention strength. The upper left section of the framework focuses on the intervention model itself. It depicts this intervention model as composed of direct components and support components. Direct components involve direct interaction with the intended population whose outcomes are hypothesized to change as a result of the intervention and whose impacts your study will measure. Support components are the strategies, resources, or preparation that activate those direct components in the study and that are specified as part of the intervention model. We can think of each component in 3 stages: as they're planned or designed, as they're offered to members of the intervention group, and as they're received by members of the intervention group. As shown here, the guide defines intervention fidelity as the correspondence between the planned and offered intervention components. Across the bottom of the figure are a set of context features, which are the focus of this webinar, that moderate various stages of this conceptual framework. And it depicts various broad types of context features, which we'll dive into more in this in our time together. One is characteristics of the implementing organization or system, also referred to as the inner setting in some of the literature. Characteristics of the intended population and participant characteristics, and characteristics of the external environment, or the outer setting or macro level, as it's sometimes referred to. And as mentioned, today's webinar really focuses across the bottom of this figure on these context features, building on information that's included in the guide mentioned earlier and cited at the bottom of this figure. Next slide, please. So broadly, the guide makes the case for devoting effort to implementation research in its various aspects and supporting researchers in producing nuanced studies that can help practitioners glean relevant information from the study. With regard to context features in particular, context features can provide insight into impact findings, such as why impacts occurred in some sites and for some participants, but not for others. And practitioners want to know the context in which an intervention was studied and assess whether it's a good fit for their own context. Now, both individual study findings and meta-analyses that draw on these individual studies can contribute to these understandings. And note that implementation research and meta-analyses do not produce causal findings. They provide exploratory information and hypotheses to explore in future work. Next slide, please. So given that an impact study plans to include context features, why do we need to prioritize them to collect information about, report on, and analyze? Next slide. So we can think of 2 broad reasons for this. There may be others. First is that the number of possible context features can be overwhelming. And if you have conducted impact studies or really studies of almost any kind, this should be a familiar challenge for you. It's infeasible for a study to collect and analyze all potentially relevant context features. And it's wasteful to collect data that won't be used. So balancing that can be very difficult. A second reason is the most relevant context features will differ from study to study and from intervention to intervention. And while we might wish it were true, there's no single list of context features that's going to fit all interventions or all studies. But before we move forward, we want to note that there are no hard and fast rules about how many context features to collect information about or to focus on in a study. And as we'll discuss, your decisions are likely to be study specific. And if time and resources were unlimited, you might want to collect information on a wide array of relevant context features, given that at any point in time, we don't know all the possible avenues of inquiry that researchers or practitioners might want to explore and know about at a later time. And within a planned study, you should consider statistical issues related to multiple hypothesis testing and statistical power. But you should also think about how context feature data can be used for generating hypotheses for future studies. So these things suggest that you might want to include as many relevant context features or at least collect information about them as you can. However, we know that time and resources are limited, and researchers need to think carefully about identifying and prioritizing the most relevant context features for their particular study and needs. And today's presentation will help you think about how to go about this process of identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and selecting the numerous set of possible context features given these very real time and resource constraints. And we want to emphasize that we'll talk about a process for doing this, that's not highly detailed. You'll need to adapt it for your study, but we provide a lot of examples throughout to try to make the broad process concrete. And next slide, please. This slide gives you a flavor of the many, many possible context features that you might consider. These could include ones that are about the intended population of participants. Intended participants might be students, teachers, coaches, staff, depending on the intervention. An example of a context feature at this individual level is years of teaching experience. Teachers with just a few years of experience might implement new interventions with less fidelity to the planned intervention compared with teachers with more experience. And we might expect outcomes for students in these teachers' classes to also be lower. Or it may be the case that newer teachers may be more adaptable or focused on implementing a new intervention with fidelity. Another type of context feature that we saw in the earlier exhibit, and that's in the middle here, are context features that include organization or school level type features, such as resource availability. So for example, space for small group meetings or data systems for keeping track of student progress. An example of a context feature at the school level is access to quiet group meeting space during the school day. So for tutoring interventions in schools where this kind of space is available, they may be implemented with higher fidelity than in schools where the only available space is a common area or hallway where there are distractions and other activities taking place. The student outcomes may also be higher in these schools. The last kind of broad potential context feature that may be familiar to you and you can think about as a group are those that include aspects of the external environment. And this is a big bucket. They include things like labor force availability or skills. Another example of a context feature in an external environment might include the accountability system of states in which a study site is located, K-12 accountability. For example, whether the systems include an optional indicator of school quality and student success, or SQSS, that's highly aligned with the intervention being tested. For example, if the intervention focuses on science and science curriculum, it'd be important to know if the state's accountability system includes subject matter indicators for science in their SQSS measure. States don't need to include this, some states do. All else equal, you'd expect that intervention fidelity would be higher in states that include the SQSS science indicator compared with intervention fidelity in states that don't include science indicators in SQSS. There are many possible measures within each of these items shown, such as within demographic characteristics, gender, race, ethnicity, English language learner status, and family income. So while this list looks big, it's even bigger once you dive into each individual item. And there are ones that aren't even listed here. This is not comprehensive. Some constructs can be relevant at the individual level and or the organizational level. So something like readiness for change is a unique construct at the individual level and at the organizational level. And you might measure it in different ways. It's not simply a matter of aggregation. For other features, you may include both individual and an aggregated version of an individual level measure, and that sort of development of the organizational level measure would be relevant. So there are many, many, many issues here. In today, we're not going to talk about the development of those measures in particular. We're going to talk about a process by which you can wade through the thicket and try to identify the highest priority context measures for your particular study. And I'll hand this off to Lauren, who will pick it up from here.
Thanks, Carolyn. And we encourage you, if you have other ideas of context features that you think are really important in studies that you work on, you can go ahead and use the chat and throw in some context features that maybe some people don't think about, but that you think are really, really useful to be thinking about. And I will move to the next slide. So it's nice to be with you all today. So as you can see from the smattering of examples that of context features we just discussed, there's just lots and lots of context features that you might want to consider collecting data on and incorporating into your planned analysis. But then it begs the question, how does a researcher go about identifying and selecting context features? So we're now going to offer a suggestion about how to do this. Specifically, researchers can use 4 different lenses, what we're calling the 4R lenses, that together can help them decide which of the many context features pertain to their specific study, and then which to prioritize collecting about and analyzing. Researchers can use these lenses during the initial study design phase, as well as through data collection, analysis, and reporting. And we're going to walk you through each lens in turn and then describe the perspectives and considerations for each. We'll then describe how researchers can use the lenses together, the 4 lenses, to prioritize and select context features for their study. So, as Carolyn noted earlier, researchers could collect information about many context features, and the most relevant and highest priority features will vary from intervention and from study to study. The overall process we're offering today can help identify features and prioritize, and this can be applied to studies of all kinds of interventions. So in the first phase of this process, researchers can use the first 2 lenses to identify a list of potential context features for the study. The first lens focuses on the requirements and recommendations from interest holders, such as funders, developers, and participants. With the second lens, you would consult the research base, including considering both theory and empirical studies. And this process for identifying potential features typically can occur during that study planning and design phase. And then you move to the next phase after researchers have gone through the initial process of identifying the relevant universe of potential context features. They can move into the review phase where they look deeper into the importance of the elements within these first 2 lenses, and also consider 2 additional lenses. Lens 3, which focuses on assessing whether the context feature is relevant for the current study's purpose and design, and lens 4, which considers how realistic it might be for the current study to be able to collect data on a particular context feature, taking into account aspects such as budget, cost, and burden on respondents. So we'll soon dive into each lens to provide more details about what this review process might entail. But before we do, we'll preview the final phase of the process, which is to use the information reviewed in the prior step, the review step, to then prioritize and select context features for inclusion in the study. So as a quick preview of where we're headed, this is an example of how a research team can use the information across the 4R lenses to prioritize and then select for inclusion in their study. We'll go into this with a more specific example later, but we just wanted to show you where we're headed. So now we'll take you step by step into the process. First, we'll focus on the first step, where a researcher would identify the universe of potential context features using lenses 1 and 2. No better place to start than lens 1, requirements and recommendations. With the first lens, you can think of this stage as casting a wide net. This may appear early in the study planning and design process. To cast that wide net, we suggest consulting with relevant interest holders, including those who may be eligible to participate in the research, for example, students or caregivers, those who may be providing the intervention, including educators or community organization staff, important decision makers within the community and other interested parties, including implementers, intervention developers, and funders. As an example, in a study of a pre-K intervention, you might ask pre-K teachers or staff using a jargon-free question like, based on your experience, what are some things that would affect whether you'll be able to implement this program well? They may respond by pointing to barriers or facilitators that they've experienced in their work, like having dedicated space for small group work, which perhaps wasn't specified as part of the intervention model. Or as another example, career and technical education staff might indicate the importance of having flexible funds available. So for example, that they can have reliable, students can have reliable transportation for internship placements. And private and public sector funders may also point out specific requirements or recommendations about context features to collect and report in a study. In addition to consulting with interest holders, we recommend researchers also consult relevant reporting guidelines. For example, clearinghouses that are relevant for their research, such as the What Works Clearinghouse, offer reporting guidelines that include a number of contextual features. You may want to consider also reviewing meta-analyses in the relevant topic area so that to see the kinds of information that are being collected, reported, and analyzed. So this slide just shows some context features about where the study occurred. These are features that the What Works Clearinghouse recommends reporting on. And it's just a little snapshot piece. It's not all of the features, but the What Works Clearinghouse reporting guide that this excerpt comes from specifies that this information is needed to facilitate What Works Clearinghouse reviews. And it lists many different types of context features. For example, whether an intervention sites in the study are in rural, urban, or suburban, or other communities, or other post-secondary studies, the types of institutions. So you can get kind of just a taste of the types of things that that these types of clearinghouses might be looking for when they're trying to describe your studies. So now let's turn to lens 2, which also is part of this initial process of casting that wide net. This second lens brings in the research literature to inform to inform selection of context features for the study. I'm doing a lot of clicking and talking at the same time. Okay, so we recommend that researchers consult prior research, which presumably has also informed the logic, model, and theory of change for the intervention being tested. Prior research encompasses theory and all kinds of empirical studies that inform the intervention. And this may include prior impact studies, as well as descriptive studies, qualitative studies, and other quantitative information. We expect that researchers will draw on prior studies as a standard part of conducting research. And identifying context features is just one type of information that researchers will be looking for in the literature. But from the perspective of fitting this into the 4R lenses, researchers can identify additional context features that they didn't identify through the first lens, also identify further specific constructs or measures within the broad categories of context features. For example, particular teacher characteristics or particular external setting characteristics. You can also use this prior research to help articulate the logic about how each potential context feature might be correlated with implementation and with impacts. For example, you might consider whether theory or prior evidence suggests that an individual or aggregate characteristic like English language learner status might be correlated with implementation and impacts of similar programs. You might also explore school level characteristics like, for example, school climate, or external features like existing state or local policies. So we've gone through that first part A of that identifying, casting that wide net, and really coming up with the list of potential context features, and maybe even understanding not just kind of domains, but really getting to like particular measures that might be useful to be thinking about. And now we've got this big pool, and we need to start understanding just how important and relevant they are. And so that we move to this next part B phase. And I'm going to start by talking about uh, using this review phase to then to I'm going to talk about lenses 1 and 2 in the review phase, but there's also 2 more lenses that we'll be considering during this review phase. And that's the third lens, which is the extent to which the context feature is relevant for the current study's purpose and design. And the fourth R, which is the extent to which including a context feature in the current study is realistic, taking into account aspects such as budget, cost, and burden on respondents. So we're going to walk through how a researcher can consider each of these 4 lenses during the review phase. So here's an example of how to go about reviewing an individual context feature through the first lens, the requirements and recommendations lens. We're going to now show you a few tables. So to get you situated, we'll walk you slowly through this first table. And here you can see that we're looking at 3 context features, A, B, and C, to assess the importance for interest holders. And in the rows, this table shows some examples of interest holders, including funders, intervention developers, and college advisors as implementers. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive, and researchers should consider which interest holders to focus on. The bottom row provides an opportunity to document the overall assessment of importance for interest holders for each context feature. Given our webinar format and to make the information more broadly accessible to participants with varied interests, we show in the columns this general template with generic context features labeled A, B, and C. But to also provide a general example, we use the case of 3 context features considered as part of a college advising intervention study. Of course, there may be many, many more than 3 potential context features in a study. This is the same table, but now you see ratings in the cells of high, moderate, and low. And here we present a simple case in which all interest holders consider context feature A as having a high degree of importance, while context feature C shows a lower level of importance across all interest holders, and context B falls somewhere in the middle. So as a first example, consider context feature A, for example, funding level. Suppose that funders of the research indicate that they require or strongly recommend that evaluations collect and report information about the level of funding provided for the intervention tested in the specific sites. In this case, ensuring that this context feature is included in the study is highly important from the perspective of funders. Similarly, suppose the intervention developers also have a strong interest in learning about the funding level and how it varies across intervention sites. So here too, the rating would be high. Finally, suppose that the college advisors themselves point to funding level as being a direct and major factor in the extent to which they're able to implement a high quality program. So that also points to a high rating. For the context feature A, then, lens 1, the requirements and recommendations dimension, the overall rating would then be high. And then now if you consider the second potential context feature B, for example, years of experience as a college advisor, suppose funders, intervention developers, and college advisors, they all express some interest in learning about this feature, then the moderate level of importance might be the appropriate rating for each individual one and overall. And then for context feature C, an example is gender of the student, where the feature is either not one that is required to be collected by the interest holders, or they didn't mention it as being of interest, or specifically indicated it was not a priority, then there would be this rating of low. Just as a quick aside before we move on, we're offering this table with high, moderate, and low designations as an example of one possible strategy for reviewing and assessing context features through this lens and through other lenses. Other approaches might involve numerical scoring, binary categories of yes and no, arriving at an overall rating using some kind of weighting, or a more qualitative assessment of relative importance for each feature or each type of interest holder. So, you know, we're just giving you this one example. You might, you and whatever team you're working with might choose to go in another direction, but hopefully this framework will be helpful to you. Okay. And now, now we're going to move to lens 2, using prior research to examine the same context features, A, B, and C, for the college advising intervention example. In the rows, this table explores the extent of evidence suggesting a correlation between each context feature and whether intervention components are offered, received, or play a role in the impact on primary outcomes. So for context feature A, in this example, funding level, suppose researchers determine that the research literature indicates that funding level is likely to be strongly correlated with both the offer and receipt of the advising intervention, as well as impacts on credit attainment. And then for context feature B, in this example, years of experience as a college advisor, perhaps based on its review, the research team might determine that feature B is likely correlated with offering the planned intervention, but evidence might be lacking about whether this feature is correlated with either student take-up of the intervention or whether it's correlated with impacts. Finally, consider context feature C. In this example, gender of the student. Based on prior theory and empirical research, a study team might determine that this feature is unlikely to be correlated with the intervention's component's offer or receipt, and unlikely to be correlated with impacts. For example, on credit attainment in the first 2 years. So now we look at that bottom row, which provides an overall assessment of the extent of correlations using the prior research lens. And in this example, the researcher's review indicates that feature A has a high level of correlation based on prior research. Feature B has moderate evidence, and feature C has a lower level of evidence of correlations. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what that process might look like. And I'm gonna send it now back to Carolyn so she can introduce you to lenses 3 and 4.
Okay. Thank you, Lauren. And now we'll go back to, remember, we're all sort of to place where we are in time. We talked about step A of identifying the pool of potential context features for the current study. The step B, where we're reviewing and assessing those potential context features through each of the 4 R lenses. And then later we'll be looking at sort of a step C, where you look across these assessments and prioritize and make selections. So we're in the middle now of the step of reviewing and assessing. and Lauren just went through the first two R lenses. By the way, we realized that recommendations and requirements are two R's in that first lens, but we wanted to keep it to one. So now we're in the relevance lens. All right, this lens involves assessing relevance to the current study. We understand that lenses 1 and 2 also talk about things that are relevant to the current study. What we mean in this lens is in particular to study sites, and we'll give a couple of examples here. So the previous lenses generally focus on the study related to the topic area, and you may hear different things from interest holders. This lens focuses very specifically on the study sites. So researchers may be able to assess some of these elements during the study design phase. And for others, they may need to wait till closer to study launch or monitor them while the intervention's being implemented and data are being collected. So for each potential context feature identified earlier, researchers can consider questions like, is the context feature present at all in the current study? And is it likely to vary within or across settings or over time in the study? So for example, in a study of pre-kindergarten literacy intervention taking place in New York City, there's no variation in whether the site is urban, either within schools, across schools, or over time. However, teacher experience or percent of English language learner students in a classroom might vary both within and across schools, as well as over time. So if variation is expected or actually does occur, and if you want to estimate mediation or moderation effects, as mentioned earlier, you can draw on existing literatures to conduct power analyses for these. Another important question to consider is whether the context feature is likely to be connected to intervention contrast in the current study. So a context feature may be associated with available services and supports that would be available to control group members or take-up of them. So for example, pre-K children in a control group in an urban area are likely to have access to more similar pre-K programming and services as a tested intervention, and thus be more likely to participate in these non-intervention services compared with children in rural areas. So holding constant the intervention offer and receipt, if the planned study is taking place in an urban area, the intervention contrast would likely be expected to be narrower than if the study were to take place in a rural area. So further, context features may change over time and might affect the intervention contrast. As an example here, suppose that a change in state policy, which is a context feature, affects pre-K curriculum standards during the study period. This change could result in more similarity to a tested intervention, it may or may not, depending on what that policy change is, than existed before the policy change. And the intervention contrast would be narrower for the study participants who enter the study after the new policy takes effect. So I hope through those examples that we provided, it's clear how this lens in particular is very study and site specific and time specific. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide will have a table like the ones that Lauren showed for lenses 1 and 2. And this table shows the same 3 example context features from earlier related to the college advising study. As we've noted, the review and assessment and the relevance of these may be different if a study of this intervention were being conducted in other sites. So this lens focuses on each context feature within the context of specific sites for the current study, not these context features in general. So in this example, we discuss features A, B, and C again, of funding level, years advising, and participant gender. And through the relevance lens and in the hypothetical study sites and settings. So in terms of extent of variation, again, this is a hypothetical, and so to provide an example, drawing out some details about it. So researchers might determine that there's a high level of variation in funding across the intervention sites, a moderate extent of variation in years of advising experience, both within and across sites, and low variation in participant gender. So this could happen, for example, if the intervention focused only on students of particular genders or was being conducted at same gender schools. In terms of the extent of connection between the context feature and contrast, we'll give a couple of examples here. So researchers could determine that there's a strong connection between the funding level and contrast. Earlier, Lauren had mentioned, I think in those examples, the funding level may be for the intervention itself, but we're also interested in funding levels more broadly that could affect the contrast. So for example, in conducting an early landscaping conversation prior to launching the intervention in study sites, but sort of after design, the study team could find that many of the campuses are expecting budget cuts that are likely to reduce staffing and resources for the campus advising offices where control group students could access services. Cuts like these would be likely to increase the intervention contrast during the first year of the study. As another example, maybe the study teams find that 2 of the campuses in a current study received a grant to bolster campus-wide student advising and outreach services that are available to all students outside of the intervention being tested, thus likely decreasing the intervention contrast. In terms of years of advising support, researchers might determine that for the most part, advising staff in the campus-wide offices at different sites have similar advising experience, both on average and in terms of variation, compared with the advising staff in the intervention being tested. These characteristics may or may not stay stable over the time frame of the study, and how students are assigned to advisors in the campus-wide advising office is unclear. So there may be some more to find out there. Hence, the researchers might determine moderate overall relevance for this feature in the current study. As a final example, suppose that researchers determine that for this specific study, there's little connection between the context feature of participant gender and the extent of the connection with intervention contrast. Again, for example, if the intervention was available only to students of a specific gender. As we look across the bottom row, which shows the overall assessment using the relevance lens for each of these or any other context features being considered, we see that funding level, years of advising, and participant gender are designated as having high, moderate, and low levels of relevance for the current study, respectively. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the 4th lens, and it considers how realistic or feasible it might be to collect and analyze information about a particular context feature in the study. We anticipate that most of you will find these considerations familiar, but we think it's useful to have it here in the framework as part of the broad considerations. So these include things like, what will the burden be on study participants and implementers to either provide data or collect data and send it on to researchers, to take surveys, for example, keep logs. The financial cost of acquiring data, processing or coding data, fact-checking, analyzing the data that come in. Feasibility and realistic considerations also come into play for data quality. How reliable and valid will the data be? What do we expect non-missingness to be? And also, what's the time frame of the study and data availability? Sometimes we can collect data, but it can't be either made available or we won't have access to it or can't analyze it within the study timeline. So taking those things into account are really aspects of whether it's realistic or feasible to collect and analyze those data. So as you probably expect, the next slide shows a similar table to earlier where the context features are analyzed according to these different criteria. For feature A, funding level, a researcher may determine that collecting information is highly feasible because both burden and cost are relatively low. This is likely information that's already being collected and is accessible and relatively easy to get in this context. Collecting high quality data is also feasible, leading the researcher to place a high rating overall for this feature using the realistic lens. We're going to introduce two new features here in order to be able to show some different ways of thinking about this. Feature D and feature E as examples of overall moderate and low ratings using this particular lens. An example of feature D in this college advising intervention study might be organizational culture in the advising units where the intervention's being tested, and maybe in the campus-wide academic or advising units. While data could be available during the study time period, researchers might judge the respondent burden of collecting information about this characteristic, the financial cost, and data quality all to be moderate, resulting in an overall moderate feasibility rating for this potential context feature in their study. Another new characteristic here to describe a different kind of rating is feature E, which might be advisor commitment, so commitment to the job. I hesitate to say availability, but some kind of measure of commitment. Researchers might determine that the burden and cost of collecting even moderately acceptable data quality for this construct would be really burdensome and costly, and lead them to rate this as relatively low for this context feature. And so low for the realistic or the realistic lens for this study. Okay, so we've gone through each of the four lenses to show how we can think about particular context features through that lens and come away with a broad overall take, where we used lenses 1 and 2 to identify the potential universe of context features. Now we turn to the decision-making process to discuss how we use that information that you would have gone through for your study up till now to prioritize and select the context features that you'll collect information about, analyze, and have available for reporting. Okay, so this is a snapshot similar to the one that Lauren showed earlier of what you might have at this point in your process. And it looks like a spreadsheet. It would be easy to do this as a spreadsheet or a table. And you may have many, many more context features than are listed here, which are context feature A through I. Here we just labeled them by letters instead of putting particular examples in, that you can imagine that you would use specific examples of features like those we showed earlier, and we'll talk through a couple of specific examples in a bit. Your list might be shorter or longer than this one. Again, this is A through I. You may have A through, triple X. And you might subdivide the context features that are in the first column in different panels. And so that you can think about them in different chunks, for example, by characteristics of the intended population or participants, the implementing organizations or systems, or external environments, or the same structure that we talked about earlier. So some broad takeaways at this point are the following. One is that features that researchers gave high assessments to across the board are slam dunks for high priority and for including in the study. Those are examples of features A or B here, where interest holders in terms of requirements and recommendations, there's very high rating coming across there. Prior research shows high relevance, relevance to the particular study and sites in terms of sort of the payoff for and the importance of measuring that context feature in the current study are very high. And it's feasible to collect those features through Lens 4. So sort of it hits it on every feature here, on every lens. They're high priority. So you're very likely to end up selecting this feature to collect information about and to analyze and report on. Likewise, features that researchers gave low assessments to across the board, across the four lenses, are low priority, and you're unlikely to include those in your study. We say likely because this will depend on overall funding and on trade-offs, which we'll get into when we talk about a lot of the in-betweens, where there's a mix of assessments across the lenses. This can occur in lots and lots of different ways. And we just show a few of those possible combination here. The next slide will look at some details of this, but a main takeaway at this point is that these mixed cases are going to require further discussion. And we advise that they can't be determined on a basis of a table like this alone or any quantitative algorithm, because there's some false precision that would go into an algorithm, we believe. Instead, we recommend using this kind of sorting and information as the basis for discussions involving the study team, funders, and other interest holders to have these conversations. So let's look at some examples of these features in the next slide. So here we'll talk about 3 examples of an overall priority that falls in this moderate range. And again, there are many possible combinations of these. A big idea here is trade-offs, judgment, and clarity. And so we're hoping that this process can help you do that. So the intervention that we'll be thinking about here and reviewing these features and the ratings through is an after-school math tutoring program for elementary students. A first example feature is family or caregivers' support of math skills and tutoring. So families encouraging kids to attend tutoring sessions, making sure that they can get there, and talking about the importance of it and so on. So under Lens 1, interest holders may be very interested in this context feature, resulting in a high rating. Under Lens 2, the research indicates that family support likely affects student attendance at tutoring and also giving it a high rating. Through Lens 3, the feature is relevant in the study. All students have families or caregivers. There's likely variation in extent of family support for tutoring in both the intervention and control groups, and it may be connected to intervention contrast, hence a high rating. However, collecting valid and reliable information about families and caregivers' views and perceptions about math skills, tutoring, or both together would be very burdensome and expensive, beyond study resources for a relatively low budget study that needs to rely on primarily administrative data. Hence, Lens 4 here had a low rating. So in this case, the study team could note the possible role that such family support would play, but likely would determine that collecting information about it in the study isn't feasible given resource constraints. If additional study funds could be obtained to support information collection about this feature, or if in conversations with the current funder or other interest holders, other aspects of the study are scaled back, so this feature, collecting information about this feature and analyzing it could be supported, then a different decision might result. Okay, a next example feature is organizational culture of the local tutoring program. So suppose that interest holders express some interest in this feature if it's possible, but it's not a requirement, so a moderate rating. Under Lens 2 for prior research, suppose there's little prior research on organizational culture in after-school tutoring programs, although theory indicates that it might be an important context feature, hence the moderate rating. Under Lens 3, the feature is relevant in the current study based on informal observations of the researchers and discussions with district leaders or local leaders. It appears that there's variation across study sites and organizational cultures, and also that org cultures of the programs available to the control group members in each site vary, thus a high rating. Under Lens 4, collecting valid and reliable information about this feature has a moderate degree of respondent burden, would be moderately expensive and result in moderate data quality, hence a moderate rating overall. So in this case, the study team might further engage with the funder and the interest holders to gauge the emphasis they place on learning about organizational culture in this particular study in the context of all the other study priorities. If information about this feature can be collected with other information that's needed, for example, as part of observations or surveys that are already being conducted, then there may be some efficiencies, and it might be something that's included. If, however, collecting this information would be a standalone activity, the researchers might decide after consultation with interest holders to shift the resources to support other higher priority data collection activities or other activities of the study. A final example feature here is the correspondence or alignment between the full scope of lived experiences of tutors and students. So suppose that under lens 1, interest holders show some interest in this feature if it's possible, but it's not a requirement, hence moderate rating. Under lens 2, prior research hasn't examined this feature in tutoring programs, or it shows mixed findings, moderate rating. Under lens 3, the relevance, the feature is relevant because students and tutors have lived experiences and they're likely to vary within and across sites. May also affect intervention contrast. For example, if tutors and students of tutoring programs that are available to control students focus on particular background characteristics in some sites, hence a high rating. And under lens 4, collecting valid and reliable information about the full lived experiences of both tutors and students in both intervention and control conditions would be really burdensome and expensive, and likely beyond study resources. Depends on what the study resources are. So overall, a researcher might determine that the study will not collect information about this feature and may or may not report about the possibility that this could matter. I'm going to hand this back to Lauren, who will provide sort of an overarching summary, and we'll go from there. Lauren?
Thanks, Carolyn. And again, there's already one excellent question that I can't wait to dive into, but please feel free to put some other questions in the chat while I do a little bit of a summary. In this webinar, we've offered a process for identifying potential context features in an impact study. We suggest that a researcher can use 4 lenses to help assess the importance of each context feature for their particular study. And we offered some suggestions about how a researcher can methodically go about prioritizing and selecting context features for this study. We encourage you to think about these context features early in the study design and throughout the study. During the course of a study, new information or research or changing conditions might become evident, and then you may choose to collect additional context information as you learn more about those unforeseen relevant issues. We want to emphasize again that there's not a hard science to deciding what data to collect and analyze. There's not a set number of context features that a study should have. The specific features selected will depend on the study's purpose and available resources, may also depend on the opportunity cost of collecting information about analyzing one feature versus another, or devoting study resources to another purpose entirely. Instead of gathering and reporting what's simply available or the least expensive, or collecting information about many features just in case, we hope that what we talked about today, these considerations we've offered, just highlight the ways that you can make informed decisions about context features for your study. And with that, we are going to open up the floor to questions. Actually, yep, let's see. I see there's one question. I'll just read it out loud. I have some thoughts, but Carolyn, you can weigh in. So Julie from Digital Promise asks, as many of us tend to research within the same areas, I imagine often we might rely on our own prior research to assess context features and often feel confident in our understandings of that context. But do you have recommendations for how to examine our own biases and identify the context we've maybe previously missed? So Carolyn, do you want to weigh in on that?
I'll dive in first, and then Lauren, welcome your ideas and also others in the webinar who'd like to add into the chat. So I can think about this in a couple of ways. So when I think one of our goals in providing this resource and the guide was to provide some supports both for developing researchers, sort of people who do not have as much experience, and also for those who may do impact studies and sort of focus on that impact measurement, but kind of not sort of care so much or pay much attention to the other parts of that framework that we showed earlier. So I think some researchers, Julie, like you mentioned, like yourself and others, have a lot of experiences. You've seen a lot of studies and a lot of contexts and a lot of features. For those, so I think for the first group who are kind of unfamiliar with the pieces, I think we often, as humans, like, copy paste from something we did before, sort of as a mental shortcut. And so part of what we're encouraging here is continuous learning and paying attention. So this is behind your question. I found that looking at studies outside of my own area actually is really helpful for keeping an eye on and being open to things I may be missing and things I thought I knew. So reading studies or dipping into studies of interventions or conference sessions, maybe something that's slightly familiar or slightly aligned, or just something different. So kind of a continual search for things I might be missing. One place I think that is often that I see is often not sort of taken account of in studies are these things like state policies or rules and regulations, because it's just not, for some interventions, it may not be the interest of the researchers, or they may not sort of know where to look for them. So that's a place that I think, are often, it's kind of missing from our research, but for practitioners who may be implementing something that they're reviewing research about, it can be very important to them. So let me stop there. And Lauren, what are your ideas?
I'll just add a few other things. I think in our presentation, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about who are the interest holders, and what kind of research you should be looking at. But really, there is that step before you start actually looking at or generating these ideas of context features and really thinking about who are the players, who are the interest holders, what do they know that we don't know. And I think we should always go into designing a study and implementing a study thinking there will be things that we will not know. And there'll be things we won't know at the beginning. There'll be things we don't know midstream in a study. And we might even need some help interpreting as we're doing our analysis. And so I think being very intentional about thinking about who those interest holders are and what is the universe of research that we might want to look at, as Carolyn was just kind of talking about. And then also being intentional about collecting data, talking to these folks throughout the course of a study can be really helpful to you in getting out of your own little box, your own little head, and our own framework. But I really appreciate this question. I think it's something to explore even further. Any other questions? I'm going to put this slide up in case people are being shy and they do have questions, but so they can reach it out directly to us. Julie responded. Okay. Anything, Carolyn, anything else that you wanted to say before we wrap this up?
One additional note is the guide that we referenced earlier that's available on the IES webpage on the SEER standards has a section on context features, and there are a lot of resources and links in there for sources for kind of thinking about what some of these context features might be. And Julie, I guess I would add this to the list too, that sometimes just kind of reading through that list afresh with each study, I find helpful to kind of think about, is this something I should be thinking about here or looking into? But that's a good resource too, that links out to many other resources and lists of things to consider.
And I just put the link to that guide in the chat. I'm not sure if it was already in there, but put it again. Okay, well, if there aren't any additional questions, I just do want to make sure that we extend our thanks to the Institute of Education Sciences for funding the guide itself, and also for supporting us in this webinar, as well as the other co-sponsors for the webinar, SRI and APAM. Again, if you have any further questions or want to reach out to us, please feel free to do so. And thank you for attending.